There is a scene near the end of Casino that people who have seen this film never fully shake. The cornfield, the daylight, the two brothers walking into an open field, and then the men emerging from the tall grass with baseball bats, and what follows the sound of it, the duration of it, the camera refusing to look away, is the kind of thing that stays with you long after the film is over. It is presented as the definitive, unforgettable conclusion of the Nicky Santoro story. And it lands with everything Scorsese intended. It is one of the most viscerally disturbing death scenes in the history of American cinema. But here is what most people watching that scene do not know. Almost none of it happened the way the movie shows it. Not the location, not the method, not the setting, not the sequence of events that led to it. The cornfield is a lie. The baseball bats are a lie. And the detail that the movie implies most darkly, that the brothers were buried while still alive, was specifically and definitively disproven by the doctor who performed the autopsies. The real story of how Tony and Michael Spilotro actually died is not less disturbing than the movie's version. In many ways, when you understand the full picture, when you understand every layer of what actually happened on the 14th of June, 1986, it is considerably more disturbing because the movie's version is brutal. The real version is intimate, and intimacy, in this context, is the more frightening thing by far. Start with what the movie shows. Casino depicts the Santoro brothers being led into an open cornfield in what appears to be late afternoon light. They walk in among men they know, men they trust, and then the attack begins sudden, overwhelming, conducted with aluminum baseball bats. The scene shows Nicky's skull being visibly caved in. It shows the brothers being beaten until they stop moving, and then it shows them being pushed into shallow graves in the same cornfield where they were killed. The implication, reinforced by the visual language Scorsese crafts with absolute deliberateness, is that at least one of them went into the ground while still breathing. That image, two men beaten and buried alive in a cornfield in broad daylight, became the defining image of the film's final act. It is the image that closes the chapter on Nicky Santoro. It is the image that audiences carry with them out of the cinema. And because Casino is built on such meticulous attention to real events, because so much of the rest of the film is documented fact, because Scorsese and Nicholas Pileggi had done years of research and had the cooperation of people who had been inside the operation, most audiences assumed this was how it happened. It was not. And to understand what actually happened, to understand the full weight of the lie, not as a criticism of the film, but as an act of genuine reckoning with the record, you have to go back to the beginning of that day. You have to start in Oak Park, Illinois, on the afternoon of June 14th, 1986. You have to start with two brothers getting dressed and removing their valuables and driving away from a house that one of them apparently believed he might never see again. Michael Spilotro lived in Oak Park, Illinois. He had a restaurant there called Hoagie's. He had a wife named Anne. He had a life that existed, at least on its surface, at some distance from the most violent dimensions of his older brother's world. He was connected to the outfit. Everyone around Tony Spilotro was connected to the outfit in one way or another, but he was not Tony. He did not have Tony's reputation, Tony's history, or Tony's accumulated record of things that could not be undone. On the morning of June 14th, Michael and Tony were both given instructions to attend a meeting in the Chicago area. The framing of the meeting, as it was presented to them, was unmistakably positive. Tony was to be promoted to capo, a significant elevation inside the outfit's command structure, the kind of formal recognition that came only to men whose standing within the organization was beyond question. Michael was to be formally inducted as a made member, the highest honor available in that world, a status that would place him inside the inner circle of the most durable criminal organization in the American Midwest. Before they left, both brothers removed their valuables: watches, jewelry, personal identification. This is a detail that surfaces in the court record and that deserves to be held for a moment. They removed their valuables before driving to a meeting they had been told was a celebration. The reasons for doing so are left to inference. Perhaps it was habit. Perhaps it was caution. Perhaps on some level that neither of them was fully prepared to acknowledge out loud, they understood that the meeting was not what it had been described as. Michael told his wife Anne something before he walked out the door. He told her that if he was not back by 9 o'clock that night, it was no good. She confirmed this in open court. He said those words to her, "If I am not back by 9, it is no good," and then he and his brother got into his Lincoln Continental and drove away. He knew, or he suspected, and he went anyway. Because in that world, the options available to a man who has been summoned by the bosses are not really options at all. You go, you show up, you walk through the door they have told you to walk through. To refuse is to announce that you know what is waiting, and the announcement itself confirms that you have already become what they have decided you are. There is no exit. There is only the door. James Marcello drove the Spilotro brothers to the house in Bensonville. This is one of the most remarkable details in the entire record. Marcello was the acting boss of the Chicago outfit at the time. He was one of the most senior figures in the organization. He was not a driver. He was not a foot soldier. He was the man at the operational apex of the most powerful criminal organization in the American Midwest. And on the afternoon of June 14th, 1986, he personally picked up Tony and Michael Spilotro and drove them to a house near Illinois Highway 83 and Irving Park Road in Bensonville, a suburban community on the edge of Chicago that sat in the shadow of O'Hare International Airport. Marcello was later convicted in federal court for his role in driving the Spilotro brothers to that house. He was sentenced to life in federal prison. He died there. The house in Bensonville was not a warehouse. It was not an industrial facility on the edge of some empty lot. It was a house in a residential subdivision, the kind of suburban setting that the court record repeatedly described as modest homes, ordinary streets, ordinary neighborhood. The kind of place where the presence of a car pulling into a driveway attracted no attention from anyone. Now consider what was waiting inside that house. According to the testimony of Nicholas Calabrese, the first made member of the Chicago outfit in the organization's history to fully cooperate with federal prosecutors, approximately 10 men were gathered in the basement of that Bensonville house when the Spilotro brothers arrived. 10 men, not 3, not 5, 10. And these were not anonymous foot soldiers assigned to the task because they were available and reliable and disposable enough to be trusted with the work. These were the senior operational leadership of the Chicago outfit. The names documented in Calabrese's testimony and in the court record of the Family Secrets trial include James LaPietra, John Feccarotta, John DeFranzo, Sam Carlisi, Louis Eboli, James Marcello, Louis Marino, Joseph Ferriola, and Ernest Infelice. These are not household names to most people. But in the architecture of Chicago organized crime in 1986, these men collectively represented the upper tier of the organization. Several of them would later be convicted in the same proceedings. Some would die in federal custody. One of them, Rocco Infelice, was the man who had stood up at the January meeting in North Riverside and said the 2 words hit him that had initiated the entire sequence of events that ended in that basement. 10 men waiting in a basement, in a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood near O'Hare. That is not the movie. The movie gives you a field, open space, daylight, the visual grammar of inevitability, 2 small figures walking into something vast and irreversible with nowhere to hide and nothing to hold on to. It is a masterful cinematic choice. It communicates everything it needs to communicate about how completely the world had closed in on Nicky Santoro. But it is not what happened. What happened was a flight of stairs going down, a closed door at the bottom, a room that had been waiting for hours, with men in it who had been there long enough to settle in and be ready. When the brothers descended those stairs and entered the basement, the moment of recognition was immediate. Tony Spilotro understood within seconds what kind of room he had walked into. The court testimony is clear on this. He knew. And in the instant of that knowledge, with 10 men standing around him and his younger brother and nowhere to go and no possibility that any of this was going to end any other way, Tony Spilotro said something. He asked if he could say a prayer. There was no reply. No one in that room acknowledged the request. No one gave him the moment he was asking for. Nicholas Calabrese, in his testimony, said that Tony received no response. He asked for a prayer. The room was silent, and then it was not silent anymore. Calabrese testified that he personally tackled Michael Spilotro and held his legs while another man strangled Michael with a rope. Both brothers were beaten. Not with baseball bats. This is a specific and documented distinction that the family secrets trial established clearly. There was no forensic evidence of baseball bats. The actual cause of death for both men, as determined by the autopsies performed on June 24th by Dr. John Pless of Indiana University, was multiple head and neck injuries consistent with blunt force trauma combined with asphyxiation caused by the lungs filling with blood. They were beaten with fists and feet. Michael was strangled. Tony received no answer to his prayer, and then the men in that room killed him. And here is where the most persistent and most widely believed element of the casino death scene has to be addressed directly. The buried alive claim. The movie implies it. The scene makes it visually apparent, or at least strongly suggestive, that the brothers are pushed into the graves while at least one of them is still moving, still breathing, still alive beneath the dirt. It is the single most horrifying implication of the entire sequence. It is the image that has lodged itself most deeply in the popular imagination of this story. Dr. John Pless, the professor emeritus at Indiana University who performed the autopsies on the Spilotro brothers, gave an interview after the family secrets trial in which he addressed this directly. His statement is unambiguous. We found nothing that would indicate that they were buried alive. Nothing. Not a trace of physical evidence consistent with someone attempting to breathe or move after burial. The asphyxiation noted in the autopsy results, which was the detail that had prompted some media outlets at the time to speculate about burial alive, was specifically caused by the lungs filling with blood as a consequence of the beating. That is a medical consequence of severe blunt force trauma to the head and chest. It is not evidence of suffocation beneath soil. They were dead before they went into that ground. The movie's most disturbing implication, the detail that lingers longest, was specifically disproven by the man who examined their bodies under clinical conditions 8 days after they were killed. Now, there is one more detail, a detail so specific, so particular in what it reveals about the final hours of these two men's lives, that it changes the texture of everything that came before it in this story. The toxicology reports from the autopsies established that both Tony and Michael Spilotro had consumed alcohol shortly before their deaths. They had drinks with the men who killed them. Sit with that. Not in a cornfield, not in the open air, not in the broad visual grammar of cinematic inevitability, but in a house around what was presumably a table in a room with the men who were about to walk them down a flight of stairs and kill them. They had drinks. There may have been conversation. There may have been the ordinary surface noise of men in that world talking to each other, business, the weather, the promotion that had been promised, and that both brothers must have been thinking about even as they held their glasses. The men who had been waiting in that basement for hours had come upstairs, or the brothers had been brought into a room before being taken downstairs, and someone had poured drinks. One source cited by investigators at the time suggested that the brothers may have had drinks with the men who killed them before the actual killing occurred. The phrase used in contemporary Chicago Tribune reporting was that the brothers may have had drinks with the killers. This is not confirmed as certainty in the forensic record, but the toxicology established alcohol in their systems, and the timeline of events makes the sequence plausible. That is the detail the movie cannot give you. Because the movie is about scale and landscape and the visual weight of inevitability. A cornfield can carry all of that. A house in Bensonville with drinks on a table and 10 men waiting downstairs cannot be filmed with the same grandeur. It is too small, too ordinary, too domestic. And it is precisely that smallness and ordinariness that makes it more terrible than any open field. After the killing, the bodies had to be moved. John Fecarata and others were responsible for the disposal. The Spilotro brothers, stripped to their underwear, one stacked on top of the other, were driven approximately 75 miles southeast of Bensonville, across the state line into Indiana, to a cornfield in the Willow Slough Preserve near the town of Enos in Newton County. The drive would have taken somewhere between an hour and 90 minutes, depending on the route. The grave was dug 5 feet deep. Or rather, it was supposed to be dug 5 feet deep. It was later established through investigative reporting and trial testimony that the burial was, in the FBI's own characterization, botched. The men responsible had buried the bodies inside a recently planted cornfield where the corn shoots were only 4 inches high at the time of burial. The fresh earth was plainly visible at the edge of the field near a tree line. There was no concealment. There was nothing to hide what had been done. A grave that was meant to disappear into a field of mature corn was instead a patch of disturbed soil in a cornfield that barely existed yet. A farmer noticed the turned earth 8 days later. He thought someone had buried a deer out of season of poacher's disposal, a common enough problem in rural Indiana. He called the sheriff. The Newton County sheriff and his deputies arrived and began to excavate. They found not one body, but 2, one stacked on top of the other, stripped to their underwear, dead since June 14th. The autopsies were performed in Indianapolis. The dental records were supplied by their brother Patrick Spilotro, who was a dentist. On June 27th, they were buried in a family plot at Queen of Heaven Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. The Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Chicago had determined that the brothers should be denied church funeral services. What does all of this mean for the movie? What does it mean to say that Casino lied about this death, the most disturbing death in the film, the death that closes the entire narrative arc of the Nicky Santoro story? It means the lie was deliberate. It was crafted. It was a series of conscious choices made by one of the greatest filmmakers in the history of American cinema, made in the service of a story that he believed, with good reason, was better served by the version he created than by the version that actually happened. Scorsese moved the murder from a basement to a cornfield because a cornfield is cinematic in a way that a suburban basement is not. He made the weapon a baseball bat because a baseball bat is iconically violent in a way that fists and feet and a strangling rope are not. He implied that the brothers were buried alive because the implication is the most horrifying available option, and because a film that has been building toward a climax of this magnitude requires the most extreme version of the available horror. He placed the Collada character among the killers because, as he told Collada directly when Collada objected, Nicky could only be lured to his death by a trusted friend, and the drama required that the betrayal be made visible in the final scene. Every choice was the right choice for the film Scorsese was making. Casino is a masterpiece precisely because it makes choices like these, choices that compress and intensify and dramatize the real world until the real world becomes something that a 2-hour and 58-minute film can hold without breaking. But the real world does not compress, and the record does not lie. Frank Collada, the man who became Frank Marino in the film, the man who knew Tony Spilotro better than almost anyone, was in witness protection when the Spilotro brothers were killed. He could not have been in that basement. He was not anywhere near Bensonville on June 14, 1986. And when he first saw how the movie had placed the Marino character at the scene of the killing, he objected. He told Scorsese it was wrong. He told the director that Marino's presence at the murder was not what had actually happened. Scorsese acknowledged this, and then he explained his reasoning. And Collada, after hearing it, accepted it, because even the man who had been there, who had lived through the real events, could recognize that what Scorsese was doing was not falsification, but translation. The movie was translating something real into a form that a cinema audience could absorb and understand and feel. Collada had his own response to the killing that is part of the record. He said he had no great hatred for Spilotro, even knowing that Spilotro had tried to have him killed. They had grown up together. They had built something together in Las Vegas, and then they had dismantled each other. And he said something about the manner of the killing that speaks to a code that existed even inside the world these men inhabited. He said that if you were going to kill a man, you shot him in the head. You did not beat him to death in a basement. He was, by his own account, disturbed by how it was done, not by the fact of it, by the manner. That is the code. Even in a world built entirely on violence, there were lines about how violence was supposed to be conducted. And the men in that Bensonville basement, for whatever reason, perhaps because they wanted it to be painful, perhaps because they wanted it to take time, perhaps because 10 men in an enclosed space with the adrenaline of what they were doing could not stop themselves cross those lines. Tony Spilotro died in a basement, not a cornfield. He died indoors in a suburb of Chicago, in a house surrounded by ordinary streets and ordinary neighbors who had no idea what was happening below their feet. He died among men he had known, men who had been part of the same organization for the same years, men with whom he had attended the same meetings and conducted the same business and navigated the same world. He died after asking for a prayer and receiving silence. His younger brother Michael died strangled with a rope, held down by a man who later testified about it under oath in a federal courtroom in Chicago. Michael had known something was wrong before he left his own house that morning. He had told his wife, he had said it plainly, and he had gone anyway. Their bodies were stacked one on top of the other in their underwear, in a shallow grave in a cornfield that was barely planted, in a county in Indiana that had no connection to anything they had ever done or been. They were found by a farmer who thought he had found a deer. They were identified by their dentist brother. They were buried in a cemetery in Illinois without the blessing of the church that had shaped the world they grew up in. Casino gives you a cornfield and baseball bats and the implication of two men buried alive in the open air. It is one of the most powerful death scenes ever put on film. It deserves to be called that without qualification. But the truth is, a basement, drinks on a table, 10 men in a room, a flight of stairs going down, a prayer with no answer. That is what Casino never showed you. And in some ways, the truth is harder to watch than the movie, not because it is more violent, but because it is smaller, because it happened in a house, in a suburb, in a room with a door, because somewhere nearby, people were living their ordinary lives, completely unaware of what was happening in that basement. And because the most feared enforcer the Chicago outfit had ever produced, the man whose name had made other men physically afraid for 15 years, died asking for something as simple as a moment to pray, and no one gave it to him.